make these meetings available online afterwards for folks who weren't able to attend the live meeting. Our meetings are public meetings, which means that anyone's welcome to attend and observe. But the members of the work group are the ones who will have be able to have audio and video. And for future work group meetings, we will be sending out information about how to sign up to give verbal public comment in the meetings. That won't be available today. We have a really full agenda, but we will be sending out information about how to do that in the future. And you're always welcome to submit any feedback or comments at any time through email. You can send that to our DUII.info email address here. And you also, if you're not on our distribution list, please feel free to put your email in the chat, and we'll get you added for that. So you'll be able to make sure to get information about future meetings and all that good stuff. Okay. All right. So just want to do just a quick check to see who all is here. I don't think I can see everybody on my screen. So let me see. I know I spoke with Kate earlier. Was Kate Duke able to join? I don't see. Okay. I know she had a family emergency and may not be able to join us today. Chris Wigg.
I'm here, Marisha.
Perfect. Awesome. Let's see. I don't see Dan Estes yet. Deborah Ruiz. Okay, don't see Deborah. Heather Jeffers.
Marisha.
I'm here. Oh,
I'm
awesome. Jose Garcia.
I'm here.
Perfect. Joseph LaMartina.
I'm here.
Perfect. Judge Bergstrom, Judge Eric Bergstrom.
I'm here. I'm on vacation in Central Oregon, so I've got iffy Wi-Fi, but I'm here and I'm going to keep my camera off to try to get everything I can.
Okay, and we'll be recording, so if something happens, we'll have this available for you later.
Great, thanks.
Perfect. Justin Nielsen.
Here.
Perfect. LaLaurie Lager.
I'm present.
Great. Lisa Duvall was not able to join us today. She had an appointment that had been long-standing and was unable to reschedule. So, but she will be here for future meetings. Mark Patterson.
Here.
Awesome. And then I'm Marisha Elkins. Mary Garcia.
I'm here.
Hi. Perfect. Matt Conrad.
I am here.
Oh, there. Yep, I see you. Rick Laracy.
I am here, Marisha.
Awesome. Great. Robert, can you tell me how to pronounce your last name?
Robert Noche. Can you hear me?
Noche. Thank you.
Welcome.
Awesome. Great to have you. Sergeant Mike Pelkey. I don't see him yet. Okay. Tammy Hooper.
Yes, I'm here.
Perfect. Tanya Cochran.
I'm here.
Great. And Winona Scott.
Hi, I'm here.
Awesome. It's so good to have you guys all here. I'm going to turn this over to my boss, Nicole, for some opening remarks. And we've got a little timeline here that I'll pull up to share with folks. So I'm going to go ahead and mute myself and turn it over to Nicole.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to ask the obligatory, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Excellent. Thank you so much. I'm Nicole Corbin, and I am one of the managers of the Oregon Health Authority's Health Systems Division, Office of Behavioral Health. I am the manager of the Addiction Treatment, Recovery, and Prevention Services programs. So I obviously have a very deep investment and involvement in the topic at hand today, right? Which is how do we move forward to a better DUII services system? So I really want to thank you all for being here. I know, we've got a group of people here from behavioral health, from public safety, from corrections, from DMV, a bunch of public servants. And I know that it has been a very challenging past 18 months. And I'm always, our work is challenging all the time. And then this past year and change has just added to the challenge. So I really want to express my appreciation to everyone being here. My experience with people like us who come to work in this world is that people are very dedicated, very driven. Some of them are so dedicated and driven that they attend a work group meeting even while they're on vacation. So thank you so much for that. And just want to center that the place that all of those different areas intersect, that I know that we are all here, is they all touch public safety and health, right? Everything that we're talking about here is about health and safety. And even though we are from a diverse group of agencies or private businesses or expertise or advocacy focuses, we are all here because we share the goal of wanting to reduce DUII recidivism. We want to increase public safety. We want to have fewer people who are harmed due to DUII. So thanks so much for being here. Very happy to have you all. And yeah, we've got 3 great presenters who are going to give us information about current research and evidence-based practice. I don't want to take up too much of their time, but I am just going to briefly go over the timeline that Marisha has up here so that we all have some context for where we're starting from, how we got here, and that will help inform us on how we make recommendations going forward. So, back in 1980, some of you probably remember that as a great year with really big hair and shoulder pads, and some of you may not have even been around to remember that year yet, but we were still in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual 3 back then. And that manual, and for those of you who are not in this field, the DSM is the source book, right? The encyclopedia of where you get information about different behavioral health diagnoses, the criteria that make them up, the recommended treatment, the research behind them. That's how you look up a cluster of symptoms and say, okay, this cluster of symptoms gives me the label that I know to treat. And back then, we would define what we now call alcohol use disorder as alcoholism. Right? There was no middle ground. You're an alcoholic or you're not. Anyone who drinks in any way that causes them a problem is an alcoholic, and the only possible solution is you just stop drinking. There's no gray area, no in between. That's the understanding of behavioral health treatment that we started from at that time. And in 1984, Oregon's DUII statutes were consolidated and they created the structure that we know today. So I want to highlight that the structure fundamentally that we know today was created in 1984, right? We have so much change since then. So much more knowledge about public safety and about research and about behavioral health conditions and substance use disorders. I mean, the world has changed a lot, and we're working on a framework that is pretty old. It's pretty old, that had big hair and shoulder pads. The most significant change that happened rapidly after that is that in 1987, the federal statutes of 42 CFR Part 2 were put into place. And what those are, for those of you who don't work again in the behavioral health field, those are federal privacy and confidentiality statutes that are put into place that require that treatment and health information, protected health information that's related to substance use disorder treatment services and diagnoses, is subject to a higher level of privacy and requires more explicit consent in order to share that information than other kinds of health information. In 1991, we moved to ASAM criteria. ASAM is the American Society of Addiction Medicine, getting my A's backwards. And this is a standardized level of criteria that make recommendations for the kind of treatment that someone with a substance use disorder needs based on 6 different dimensions of their life. So it's getting a little more sophisticated, right? It's not just you're an alcoholic or you're not. It's let's talk about someone's recovery environment. Let's talk about their physical health. Let's talk about the history they have in the past. Also in 1991, motivational interviewing was introduced. Motivational interviewing is an evidence-based practice that I think anyone who's worked with people in addiction or in the addiction world for any time has sort of heard the, oh, you can't help someone until they hit bottom, or we can't make a difference until they're ready to change. Well, motivational interviewing is an evidence-based practice that helps kind of dig into that and helps move someone who's not ready to change towards that change rather than just maybe waiting till they hit bottom. And if you want to go ahead and go to the next screen, you'll notice we in 1995 we had the first kind of meta-analysis of DUI rehabilitation program research, which is exciting, but it didn't tell us a whole lot. This was a new field and we were starting to get information on it, and essentially good analysis of that data would say we're not 100% sure what works, so probably let's offer education and treatment to everyone, because education and treatment surely shouldn't hurt and probably will help. In 1996, we got HIPAA, so the general protections of protected health information and medical privacy statutes, sort of for general health conditions, caught up to the protections for alcohol and other drug use kind of conditions much later. We jumped to 2011, and in 2011 is when we got some changes within Oregon, which we enacted what we called sober diversion, which is again something that we're using now, but changing terms of diversion to include a participant's agreement to abstain from use of intoxicants for the entire time that they're in diversion, right? There are some exemptions made for sacramental wine or prescribed medications, but again, this still goes back to that idea of you're an alcoholic or you're not, and the only possible treatment is 100% abstinence, which we know some people really struggle with. So in 2014, we now started to actually get some new and updated information, right? We had the second meta-analysis of data came out, and it confirmed that what we really need is research on identifying an individual's risk of recidivism, and that the interventions need to be individualized, need to be customized to prevent recidivism. So we're moving away from the one-size-fits-all packet. We're moving to research-based interventions. And then in 2014, we also in Oregon had ballot measure 91, which is what legalized cannabis for retail use. We had medical cannabis in Oregon for some time, but now we've got retail cannabis, and so it's a substance that can be intoxicating, but is no longer an illegal controlled substance, and that obviously had an impact on people's legal culpability for using the substance, but certainly didn't take away the legal culpability for driving if they were intoxicated by that substance, and didn't take away the risk that's associated with that. Then many things happened in 2020, but the one that is relevant to our conversation today is that ballot measure 110 passed, and we are deep in the throes of working to implement that right now and to find out what the impacts are going to be. But the fundamental purpose of ballot measure 110 was to decriminalize possession of controlled substances, with the idea that criminalizing a healthcare condition or a activity related to a healthcare condition was sending a lot of people to jail or prison and not really treating their condition. And so how Oregon implements that and the long-term effects of that, of course, are no longer known, or are not yet known. And that brings us to where we are right now. We are here to start off the DUII Services Modernization Workgroup. Again, I thank you all so much for being here and participating. The idea that we are all working towards here is what I said in the beginning, that we are absolutely committed to making our system work better, making our system more evidence-based so that we can reduce DUII recidivism. We don't know what's going to come in the future, right? We think it's pretty likely that the per se limit is going to be reduced to 0.05%. There has been legislation in the past that has not succeeded, but again, I anticipate that in the future we're going to have legislation change so that someone can be considered charged with a DUI for any impairing substance, not just the ones that are called out in statute right now. So that's a little bit of background for everyone. Hopefully that gives us a sense of what brought us today. And now I want to just briefly identify our three speakers, and if they want to introduce themselves farther, of course they can. But we've got Judge Neil Axel from the American Bar Association, who is a National Judicial Fellow. We've got James Eberspacher from the National Center for DWI Courts. And we've got Mark Stadola from the American Probation and Parole Association. So I thank you all for being here, and I'm going to turn the mic over to our speakers. Or Marisha, do I need to turn this over to Sandy, and is she going to facilitate that?
Nope, go ahead. It's all Mark and his team.
All right.
All Mark and his team.
They're loading the PowerPoint. Thank you, Nicole. I was hoping you were going to mention parachute pants and fry boots when you're talking about the 80s, because you really weren't representing the men. And of course, you don't wear parachute pants with fry boots because that would be a major fashion faux pas. So good afternoon. Welcome, everybody. We are very glad to be able to be joining you. And I am Mark Stodola. I serve as the Probation Fellow for American Probation and Parole Association. And I'll let my co-presenters introduce themselves. But I will tell you, we are kind of scattered through the country. I am in Phoenix, Arizona, where it is a balmy 102 degrees, so not too bad. And Judge, you want to introduce yourself?
Certainly. Thank you, Mark. I'm Neil Axel. I am the American Bar Association National Judicial Fellow for Highway Safety Issues, and also serve as a senior judge on the District Court of Maryland, a court of limited jurisdiction, principally responsible for criminal misdemeanors, impaired driving, and civil matters. And I'm calling in from Central Maryland.
Jim?
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Jim Eberspacher. I'm the division director with the National Center for DUII Courts. We're a division underneath the National Association of Drug Court Professionals. Our division's focus is to provide training and technical assistance around DUI courts, or in Oregon, as they're stated, DUII courts. And I work remotely. Our office is based in Alexandria, Virginia, but I moved back to the state of Minnesota a couple of years ago, so I'm based out of the Twin Cities.
All right, well, with that said, I want to give just a little bit of a backstory on this presentation. The three of us had the honor of presenting this information actually several times at the Lifesavers Conference. And a big part of this training was really looking at getting the information out to basically the criminal justice population about what happens after somebody is convicted and what works and what doesn't work when we're talking about this DUI population. And I think the aha moment for the three of us was doing this presentation, and there were probably over 100 people when we first did it. Law enforcement, judges, attorneys, the whole 9 yards. And we asked how many of them understood with some degree of confidence what happens when somebody is convicted of a DUI. And bottom line was there were just over maybe a handful of arms that were raised when we asked that question, which really kind of brought home to us the importance of recognizing when we're dealing with this population, what we need to do to make sure that that first DUI doesn't become that second DUI. So some of that led to really our desire to put this presentation together. So what our plan is between the three of us is to give you some background, kind of a state of the state of what we're seeing nationally when it comes to DUIs, but we also want to cobble down to what we're seeing in Oregon when it comes to this population, some of the unique challenges working with them, and really some of the characteristics that we see that make that high-risk population look maybe a little bit different than those individuals that are kind of one and done when it comes to DUIs. We're then going to focus on really the judicial perspective, view from the bench on how to best deal with this population. And then Jim is going to talk about other characteristics of this population, but most importantly, how to best treat and address the specialized populations via DUI courts and the like. So the other thing that we would appreciate is, in as much as is possible, to make this a bit of a conversation. So with that said, if you have questions, if any of us are maybe too cryptic with our information, please don't hesitate to interrupt. We will take no offense. In fact, we prefer that. So with that said, let's move on to the next slide. And the next slide after that. So we're going to be talking primarily about alcohol impaired driving, but I really want to emphasize that a lot of what we discuss applies to all impaired driving. So I don't want this to be pigeonholed where the assumption is that driving under the influence of drugs looks dramatically different, because when we're talking about the behaviors of this population, they're very, very much the same. So if I am using the term alcohol, it really is going to apply to all the individuals that are impaired who get behind the wheel. And as you're experiencing in Oregon, and we're starting to experience to a greater extent in Arizona, this is becoming, the polysubstance use especially is becoming more and more of an issue. So next slide. So let me throw some numbers at you so we can get a sense of what this population looks like. So 2019, which is the last reporting year that NHTSA received information, about 1 million individuals were arrested for DUI in this country. And that number, I wouldn't call it static, but from one year to the next, it doesn't vary by a whole lot. It might be 1.1 million one year, maybe 900,000 another year. But what we see is pretty consistent from one year to the other. Now, I want to tell you that when these numbers go down, it has nothing to do with what we are doing to try to address impaired driving. It has everything to do with law enforcement priorities, law enforcement budgets. For example, if priorities change and perhaps there isn't the ability to do DUI stops or saturation patrols, that sort of thing, then those numbers might go down. But as much as I'd love to say when these go down that it's our success and we should pat ourselves on the back, that really isn't necessarily the case. So DUI fatalities occur about every 48 minutes. In 2019, there were 10,142 people killed in alcohol-related crashes. And I will just tell you as a quick aside, I learned the hard way that we never refer to these as accidents. An accident is just that. But when somebody gets loaded, get behind the wheel of a car and turn on that ignition, that's premeditated. And everything that happens after that is on them. So a couple other things that are noteworthy. It typically, what we're looking at with these fatality crashes is BACs that are about twice the legal limit, so 0.16 or above. But let me draw your attention to this bottom bullet because it's significant. 111 million drunk driving episodes occurred in this country in 2018. Now, that's not 111 million drunk drivers. That's 111 million episodes. So conceivably, you could have somebody that maybe was on my probation caseload that drove 5 or 6 times under the influence of something during the course of the day. So you look at those episodes and you look at the number of individuals who are arrested for DUI, and it makes it very clear that what we're doing is really just touching the tip of the iceberg when it comes to impaired driving. Now, a couple other numbers to give you that I think are significant. NHTSA, National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, has for years said that based on their research, that on average, a drunk driver or impaired driver drives about 80 times before they're stopped. And Dr. Ed Latessa from University of Cincinnati has done research on this, and he suggests that in urban areas, that number is closer to about 200 times. And in rural areas, that number is much closer to about 2,000 times. And when you think about it in rural communities in particular, where you don't have the same law enforcement presence as you would in more of an urban area, it makes sense that somebody could drive impaired from point A to point B and assuming they don't get into a crash, not necessarily be detected. So that's pretty much what we are seeing nationally. Now, the information for 2020 has not been released yet from NHTSA, but I can tell you that the information that they have so far has basically indicated the traffic fatalities in 2020 went up by over 7%. Now, I don't know what the impaired driving numbers look like, but when you think about the fact that there were, I believe, like 1 billion fewer miles driven due to the pandemic in 2020, the fact that these numbers still went up is really concerning. So I am not looking forward to hearing anything positive when the rest of those numbers come out. So next slide. So I'm going to give you some good news, and I hate to say it, but usually when I give good news, it's followed by bad news. So don't get too excited because I'll probably be letting you down in the next minute or two. Here's the good news. The good news is since 1982, the number of drunk driving deaths in this country have dropped by well over 50%. And there are a number of reasons for this. One is that all of us are much more likely to survive any kind of a crash today than certainly before the advent of airbags, before people started using seatbelts with regularity, and I'm going to talk about that in just a second. The other issue that has really helped with these numbers is social norming. And what we have been finding is through PSAs, I think just through cultural changes, people are more and more apt to not get loaded and get behind the wheel of a car. And just by way of a quick example, when my daughter went off to college, I didn't have to yell at her about drinking and driving. It was a culture of her and her friends that if that was going to occur, they'd take Uber, they'd take Lyft, they'd take a cab, they'd walk. So that has had a positive impact on these numbers being dropped. So let me just give you an example of social norming that I think really kind of fits into this. In 1993, about 56% of drivers in this country wore a seatbelt. And I think part of the reason they didn't was that there was that old myth that, you know, if you were driving and you had a seatbelt on and your car caught fire, that you'd be trapped, so you're better off not using a seatbelt. Well, flash forward to 2019, and about 91% of all drivers wear a seatbelt. So that, my friends, is really a sterling example of how social norming works. The progress that we have made in this regard when it comes to drunk driving is where we need to be going when it comes to drug impaired and specifically marijuana impaired driving, because those attitudes are kind of like where we were with alcohol and driving back in the 80s. We have a long way to go. So we should be pleased with the fact that these numbers have dropped, but here is the challenge. And the challenge is that really over the last, I would say, 10 years, these numbers have really plateaued. And what we found is approximately 1/3 of all traffic fatalities are alcohol and or drug related. I'd love to give you firm numbers on what the drug impaired driving population looks like, but we have a long way to go in consistently collecting that data. But the challenge is we have really not been able to crack that number to bring it down below that 1/3 mark. And folks, from the perspective of our being a first world country, this is really a damning indictment. We're number 2 in the world when it comes to impaired driving, only behind South Africa, which is at about, I believe, about 58% of all their traffic fatalities are alcohol related. So next slide. This slide gives you an idea of the percentage of alcohol fatalities across the country. And as you can see in Oregon in 2019, about 34% of traffic fatalities were alcohol and possibly drug related. And just to kind of put this in a little bit of perspective, there are several states that unfortunately are pretty much frequent flyers year after year when it comes to impaired driving deaths. Texas, North Dakota, Montana are definitely one of those. Those are kind of those frequent flyers. And then Utah is typically the lowest. And in 2019, about 16% of all their traffic fatalities were alcohol related. And interestingly enough, Nicole had talked about legislation to lower the BAC to 0.5. This occurred several years ago in Utah. And while it's certainly not the single factor by any means that these numbers are so low, in fact, they're still looking at the research, but they may very well be seeing some positive results. So before I jump to the next slide, I want to leave you with three numbers that I think are very important to mention. First one is 400,000. Since 1982, there have been over 400,000 people killed in drunk driving crashes in this country. The next number I want to give you is 214. Of the 10,142 people that were killed in drunk driving crashes in 2019, 214 of them were children. And then the last number I want to give you is 115. Of those 214 children, 115 were passengers in the car being driven by the drunk driver. So you can really make the case that those individuals were hostages in the car being driven by the drunk driver. So next slide. And also, Marisha, I did notice in the chat line it's lit up. I don't know if there's a question for us or if it's a technical issue, but just letting you know about that. So let's talk about what we're seeing in Oregon. The first slide is information on DUI arrests in Oregon, and this information is obtained through the FBI, and it shows a number of arrests 2015 through 2019. And I think the biggest takeaway from this slide is just to recognize that on average, probably between 12 and 14,000 individuals in Oregon every year are getting DUIs. And what do we know about this population? Well, we don't know much when we're first seeing these numbers, but what we can tell you statistically is that you're going to have probably a third of those that are going to be repeat offenders, and 2/3 where it is their first DUI, and we don't know if there's going to be a second DUI. But I think looking at those numbers, it's important to recognize that every one of those individuals potentially is capable of bringing future harm to our communities. So important to keep an eye on that. Next slide. So this next slide, this is from National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, and these are DUI fatalities 2015 through 2019. And as you can see, the range here is anywhere from 31% to 35%. And again, the national average was about 29% in 2019. So that's kind of one way to compare to other states. Next slide. So a little bit more information on Oregon, and this is also taken from the NHTSA website. So the picture on your left are total DUIs per county in Oregon. And the dark red counties are 6 to 15. The green is 16 to 25. And the lighter blue is less. And then those counties that are in white had no reported DUIs in 2019. But the picture on the right is a little bit more telling. And these are DUI fatalities per 100,000 population. So I've learned kind of as a rule of thumb that you never want to see your county in red. Red is never an attaboy, you guys are doing a great job. It's a sign that there's probably a little bit of a problem here. So the counties here in red are in the upper third for DUI fatalities per 100,000 population. Counties in gold are middle third, and then green is in that lower third. So I don't know what county you're in, but I assume you do, and that's probably the important thing. So just it kind of gives you an idea of what we're seeing. And then just a quick shout out to NHTSA. Their website has great information on statewide trends, but also county trends. And when you're looking to advocate for services, this can be great information to share with those individuals that are doing the funding as to what in particular, what those trends look like in individual counties. So I think it's good information to know. So next, please. And you can click the next couple down. So now that I've depressed you with what these numbers look like, overall fatalities, I do want to just touch briefly on what we're seeing with community supervision. So that could be probation, parole, could be reporting directly to the court. About 4.3 million individuals are under some sort of community supervision. And what we have found is about 15%, which is about, say, 750,000 individuals have a DUI in their arrest history. Doesn't mean that's why they're being supervised necessarily, but it does mean that this is a group of people that got loaded and got arrested for impaired driving. About 8% of this population have been convicted of multiple DUIs. And when I say that, we're talking 3 or more DUI convictions. And then finally, the bottom bullet is about 2/3 of these individuals are drug or alcohol involved. Now, I have to tell you, I have had the honor of presenting at probably about 45 states, not as many as Jim, but I'm working on that. And the one thing I can tell you without question is that DUIs are the most inconsistently sentenced and supervised population in the criminal justice system. And folks, we are all over the map in terms of how we deal with them. For every department that or community that assesses individuals for risk, that really puts their resources to those people most likely to reoffend, there are jurisdictions that don't do any kind of assessment, any kind of evaluation. From a supervision standpoint, there are jurisdictions that take all DUIs and place them on unsupervised caseloads. And research will tell you that if they're low risk, that's absolutely an appropriate response. Research will also tell you if you haven't looked at those risk factors, then you are running a strong probability that they could reoffend, get another DUI, or much worse. So we have a long, long way to go in really recognizing the threat that this population has to our community. Next, please. The other thing that is important to remember, and this is something that we really try to emphasize in the courts, we try to emphasize when it comes to all different types of supervision, is this: DUI cases are the only crimes where the investigation oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes stops after obtaining that minimum amount of evidence. So for example, the holy grail of DUIs is that 0.08. We have decades of research to understand what this population looks like. With drug impaired driving, this is, relatively speaking, really kind of a new frontier for us. So the reason this is important to remember is we can't make the assumption that when somebody is arrested for driving under the influence of alcohol, that alcohol was the only thing on board with these individuals. And there have been numerous studies with a variety of different types of populations. In fact, 3 in particular that showed individuals that were arrested for driving under the influence of alcohol who were then drug tested, about 40% of this population, they found that there were drugs on board in addition to alcohol. Next slide. So I think it's very, very important for the system to recognize that we can't assume that alcohol is the only drug on board when it comes to this population. And the message that we really try to impart when we do these trainings is, folks, I don't care if somebody has been drinking Ham's beer for the last 70 years, you can't assume that that's the only drug they're going to be using, because the research is showing us that polysubstance use is really becoming more and more common. Next slide. So here's a little bit of good news, and that is that 2/3 of the individuals who we deal with in community supervision self-correct. So this could be the shame of being arrested. It could be a variety of different issues that fall into this, perhaps losing a family, losing a job, but we don't see these people again. We don't know if they stopped drinking or drugging, and frankly, I don't know if that should be our primary concern. We're not seeing them on the road again, and that is the good news. Next slide. The challenge we have is, what do we do with that other third that don't learn the first time, the second time, the 10th time? How do we deal with that population? Next slide. And you can scroll down on these. Some of the challenges that we have within the system is that there's this lack of recognition that a DUI is a serious problem. And back in the Stone Age, when I was a young probation officer, when dinosaurs ruled the earth, I remember my first DUI case. The individual came up to me in the lobby and said, "I have got great news. I'm not a criminal. I'm not like those people in the lobby. I just got a DUI." And then, of course, I only got had 2 beers. The cops were out to get me. I'd never been drunk in my life. So lots and lots of challenges that are kind of unique to this population that make them really different in many respects than the rest of the people that we find going through our criminal justice system. Next slide. And next slide. So let's talk a little bit about how we determine, you can click the next 2, who those people are who are most at risk. So this is a little exercise that I do when I am doing a live presentation, but I'll ask the audience, and you don't have to respond to this, but you can think about your response. Ask the audience, which one of these 3 individuals is most likely to recidivate? And the first individual is a 23-year-old man arrested for an extreme DUI, no adult arrests. He had a prior DUI as a juvenile. Second individual is a 51-year-old woman arrested for an extreme DUI, and she had a previous DUI about 8 years prior. And then the third individual is a somewhat over-the-hill actor arrested for an extreme DUI, and he had a prior DUI about 12 years earlier. So I will tell you, when I do this exercise, 90% of the time, the response is it's contestant number 2 who's most likely to recidivate. And contestant number 2, and I should be honest with all of you, is my wife, Sue. And I should mention, she did not get a DUI. I did this training about 5 years ago, and there was a woman in the audience who said, "It's contestant number 2. She looks like a total drunk." So I told my wife that. I thought it was funny. She didn't. So I don't tell her anymore. The answer to this exercise is beats me. But the information I just gave you is what typically the court receives. Arrest history, age, maybe throw in employment, and oftentimes that's about all the information that's available for a judge to determine what is the best way to address this person's issue, keep them accountable, and keep the community safe. So that is really the challenge that all jurisdictions have to go through in really keeping us safe. Next slide. So let's talk about who really those high risk, what that high risk population looks like. Next slide, please. So first of all, what we see when we're talking about impaired driver profiles, and these are the people that are kind of that medium risk. No shock, predominantly male, between the ages of 20 and 45, but that sweet spot is really between 20 and 30. Brains aren't fully developed. We think we're Teflon at that age. We can drink heavily and get up the next day. The long-term impact of substance use hasn't necessarily caught up with them. This is a population that is employed and educated at a higher rate than other criminal justice populations, typically high BAC levels, typically drink more per occasion, consume more alcohol than the general population. Majority of these individuals are binge drinkers. When I say binge drinking, we're talking about, for men, 5 or more drinks in one setting, and for women, 4 or more drinks in one setting. This is a group that usually has other substance abuse or substance use dependencies. They have personality, psychosocial factors that increase the risk of offending. They're irritable, aggressive, impulsive. They are a blast to supervise. Next slide. So now let's talk about who the real high risk population is. If that population didn't scare you enough, let's look at what we're seeing with those individuals that are really the repeat offending population. Overwhelmingly male, more often single, separated, or divorced. And when I talked about some of those personality characteristics, you can probably understand why they would be. They tend to have lower levels of education, higher levels of unemployment compared to first offenders, very, very high BACs. And then we also see early onset of drinking and familial history of drinking behavior. And when I'm saying early onset, it's not unusual for our clients to talk about really getting actively involved with consuming alcohol at age 10 or 11. So again, some of the factors we're seeing. Next slide. Other issues that we see, especially individuals with long-term alcohol dependence, they tend to have cognitive impairments, brain damage as a result of long-term alcohol use, tend to have more antisocial personality characteristics. And Jim's going to talk a little bit about, when we talk about recidivism, some of the factors we look at with this population. And I'll just not to give you the jump too far into his presentation, but it's not just alcohol use. There are lots of other factors here. The other thing is lack of motivation, which can impact willingness to engage in treatment. Nicola talked about motivational interviewing. We have found with DUIs that this can be one of the most powerful tools to try to get that intrinsic motivation to make changes. But what we're hearing anecdotally, but we're hearing it across the country, and it would be a great research project, is it's more and more common for individuals who are popped for DUIs to opt to do their jail time or their prison time rather than to be supervised. And folks, for these people with priors, we got to be honest, they can do, 3 months in jail or 6 months in prison standing on their head. And with jail overcrowding, it's reasonable to anticipate that oftentimes these sentences are going to be reduced. Next slide. So hopefully the information I've just given you will kind of set the table for Judge Axel's information regarding the judicial perspective.
All right. Thank you, Mark. I didn't mention earlier, I've now served almost 25 years on the bench in Maryland. And some of that time, I also headed up both a drug court and a DUI treatment court. And much of the profile that Mark just described is exactly what my experience has been and what I've seen from the bench, particularly with the impaired driver. They don't think they're criminals. They don't think they did anything wrong. How come everyone else can drink, but I can't when they're on probation? And certainly, though, many of them would rather just do a flat sentence than to report to an agent, go through assessment and treatment and testing. But with the alcohol impaired driver, one of the other things that distinguish them from perhaps others, they're more difficult to catch in violation, particularly because depending upon what type of testing regimen is being used in supervision. But the alcohol impaired driver, if they're going to violate their supervision terms, often can drink the night before, and by the time they go in for a urine test the next day or later in the week, the alcohol is dissipated from their system. At the same time, one of the things I've noticed is that with this population, when they are under supervision, the probation departments oftentimes are dealing with competing interests where they're supervising many other degrees of misdemeanors and felonies and giving greater attention to those because of the higher public safety risk. And so many of those who were supervised for their first, second, third DUIs might not be getting the attention and the supervision and the follow-up that is so critical for changing behavior. We've seen this stark difference, for example, when you look at the DUI court treatment model that Jim's going to talk about. When you have that intensive supervision and the immediate follow-up and the immediate use of sanctions and incentives to motivate behavior change, we see very different outcomes. And so that's a very important distinction. And as Mark mentioned, in addition, one of the things from the judicial perspective that always strikes me is that, as he indicated, that so much is changing now as far as the nature of the or the face of the impaired driver, where studies have really shown that more and more individuals are testing positive for marijuana in their system while driving, as opposed to alcohol, and of course the significant increase in polysubstance abuse. Even though that's having a tremendous impact on statistics and why we're having a difficult time trying to quantify drug impaired or polydrug impaired driving, for a judge, very often I won't even find out that the individual was under the influence of drugs when they appear before me, because
your signed copy.
All right, we're getting some background noise. If someone could please mute. When
I was talking to Liz about it, I remember.
Stephen Seeley, you need to mute yourself.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I might have someone come before me and they have a blood alcohol level of 0.12, and if the investigation hasn't gone further to look for the presence of drugs or test for drugs, whether it's through a drug recognition expert or through a drug test, I'm sentencing as if his only use of drugs is alcohol. And so I may not have enough information to either fashion a sentence or for probation and supervision, community supervision, to have information to help determine what needs to be done moving forward in that case. And it is a problem. Next slide, please. Historically, the criminal justice system has been there to address the consequences of alcohol and drug use. This quote goes back many years, and an encounter with the criminal justice system gives us an opportunity to intervene and make changes in the lives and address the needs of substance abusers. This is the nature of a significant part of sentencing. It's the nature of our treatment courts, and it gives us an opportunity to intervene. Measure 110 may certainly impact that, at least with regard to those who are charged or are found to be in possession only, and it may not have as much impact on those who certainly won't have the impact on those charged with impaired driving. But it is a shift in public policy, let's say, in that the underlying substance use disorders should be addressed in the healthcare community and not as much in the criminal justice system. And that's an interesting challenge moving forward. But it is clearly we've been able to use, as we've learned more and more about treating those offenders who come before the court, being able to use the system and some of that the coercive aspects of sentencing to make changes and to promote change. And so from a judicial perspective, there are a couple areas and a couple times in which the courts can intervene to help promote change in behavior and to identify and then address substance use and other issues. And I'll say really at this point, remember that, as I think Oregon has recognized many years ago, that when we talk about substance use disorders, those disorders include not just the use of alcohol or drugs. It really is a cluster of multiple systems, cognitive, behavioral, and physiological symptoms that have continued in an individual, and they continue using substances despite significant consequences. So one of the things that I'm going to talk about in a minute is this idea of having more information. The more we know, the more a judge knows, the more that probation knows, the more that the treatment provider knows about the various systems at play, whether it's behavioral problems, mental health problems, vocational problems. These all can help. These all need to be addressed in order to be successful in treatment. Next slide, please. We talk so much about sentencing, but I do want to just take a moment to talk about pretrial release, because it does provide an opportunity to assess, evaluate, and intervene when someone has a substance use disorder. When it comes to pretrial release, oftentimes one of the considerations is that individual's, whether that individual poses a danger or a risk to the community. Well, if there are pretrial release programs in place, if there's a mechanism to make as a condition of pretrial release for those who are not just released from the station on their promise to appear, it's an opportunity well before the trial date to have an individual evaluated and to undertake treatment as soon as possible. We know that the earlier that one engages in treatment, the more successful they can be. And judges can fashion conditions of release that could include testing and evaluation, testing and treatment, as well as ongoing supervision. So it is an early opportunity. Next slide, please. The real challenging aspect is really in the sentencing of the impaired driver. And as you can see from this report out of Michigan a number of years ago, it's not a straightforward, it's not an easy, straightforward process. And although, as Mark said, sentencing is all across the board around the country, everything from DUI treatment courts to judges who impose just flat sentences or unsupervised supervision and a monetary fine, but controlling it and preventing it is extremely complex, and it requires more than just the judicial fine, the judicial jail, or unsupervised probation. And it has to be geared towards all of those behavioral and cultural attributes that go with alcohol and or drug consumption. And we've watched over time and over the years that there are better ways of dealing with this high risk impaired driver, particularly as culturally we're moving more and more away from jail and more towards treatment as the appropriate response. Next slide, please. And this was reflected in a quote from the former Missouri Chief Justice, Justice Price, when he noted in his State of the Judiciary address a number of years ago, we've got to have a better way. We need to move from this anger-based, jail-based sentencing that ignores cost and effectiveness to evidence-based sentencing. Evidence-based sentencing that focuses on results, on outcomes, on reduced recidivism, sentencing that relies upon some of the things we've been alluding to up until now, and that's each offender's risk and their risk, and then also fitting that offender with the most effective rehabilitation that they may need. And part of that, next slide, please, as I mentioned a bit earlier, is really, oh, actually, I'm sorry, I almost forgot about this. Michigan has had a very interesting response to this, and they have by statute required that prior to any sentencing for impaired driving, that the court must order the defendant to undergo a screening and assessment so that the judge can then have that information when he or she is sentencing them and perhaps then fashioning the sentence to include whatever appropriate treatment and other treatment and other services that may be necessary. And you know, of course, across the country, the decision of the degree of supervision, the degree of treatment does vary. Sometimes sentencing judges will be very specific with regard to what those conditions are. Sometimes it can be as simple as a judge ordering as a condition of probation to follow the lawful directions of your probation agent and attend whatever treatment, whatever evaluations, whatever assessments, whatever treatments your probation agent directs. There sometimes can be a disconnect when it's that general. And you know, I'll go back to the treatment court model, because in the treatment court model, you know, you've got immediate responses. You may have a treatment provider doing the assessment, but within 2 weeks, the court's aware of it. The court can respond to it. The court can incorporate it into a treatment plan. The court can respond if that individual doesn't commence treatment or continue treatment. Sometimes if it's a general condition and the individual, the high-risk offender, is not being intensively supervised, they can slip through the cracks very easily. Next slide, please. As I suggested earlier, one of the real key things is information. You know, I guess from a judicial perspective, judges sit in the middle weighing really what we hear from everyone in the courtroom. And we are basing decisions upon the information provided by prosecutors, based upon information provided by defense counsel, and if we have available, based upon information provided by our probation departments by way of either assessments or pre-sentence investigations. And as we're dealing with heavy dockets, sometimes we have to just make those decisions on the fly. And so if a prosecutor presents more information, if a defense counsel provides information, if we have evaluations presented to us, we can better understand what's going on. And as David Wallace recognized a number of years ago, as judges, we all understand that with more information, a sentence can be better tailored, and we can be more effective in that sentencing decision. You know, seasoned judges can look at a report sometimes and see what's, you know, where there are signs and signals and red flags. You know, if a report, for example, indicates several prior failed treatments or prior hospitalizations that were not based upon an arrest, That's information that might be helpful in both sentencing and then supervising that defendant. Next slide, please. And so some of the issues that judges are facing, obviously, clearly post-COVID, there's a significant pressure on the court to move cases, to clear backlogs, and even pre-COVID, docket pressures had a way of moving judges into becoming more standard in what they're doing, just pushing cases through, getting them off their desk. And once that individual sentence, it's not that judge's problem anymore. They're on to the next case. I very often encourage judges, particularly with the high-risk impaired driver, to try to look for creative ways to follow up with one sentence. If they are not placed in a treatment court or part of a DUI treatment court model, have review hearings, get regular reports back from probation, even when that individual is doing well. The purpose of review hearings being to do several things. One, that lets the offender know that you're watching. Secondly, if they are doing well, you can then use that opportunity to give them positive reinforcement and share with them, I'm really proud about the way you're addressing this. You're doing a great job. Positive encouragement, they say from all the research, is far more helpful to changing behavior than the negative consequences of a sanction. If they are not in treatment, if they're slacking on treatment, one of two things. One, they can be sanctioned that much quicker. Maybe the treatment plan isn't working. Maybe the treatment provider isn't the right fit. Treatment plans, for example, and we learned this from the treatment court movement, don't have to be and should not be cut in stone. They have to change. Some of the other issues I mentioned, lack of information. Clearly, sometimes lack of tools to effectively address the high-risk offender. Funding, programs, tools become a real issue sometimes. And sometimes judges, as Mark said, when we did this program in one of the Lifesavers programs, have no idea what happened after they sentence a defendant to 2 years of probation with certain conditions, have no idea what takes place when they walk out the door. And that's a challenge. And so you certainly, I always encourage judges to, my big thing is take someone to lunch. So take a probation agent to lunch, find out what they do, find out how they work, find out how they are able to adequately supervise and deal with the individuals placed on probation. Next slide, please. So just for all involved, whether it's judges or whether it's probation agents, a couple suggestions. The goal is not to successfully complete the sentence and the probation. The goal is to long-term reduce recidivism. And I think that that should be kind of almost a paradigm shift. And secondly, we too often overlook mental health services. And so combining substance use treatment with mental health services is extremely important. As was said at the very top of this meeting, one size does not fit all. A 26-week canned program or 12-week canned program may hit some people, but it certainly doesn't impact well the high-risk impaired driver. Open up lines of communication between the court, take that probation agent to lunch, or have a bench meeting for judges in a county bench or a local bench to understand what's going on between the court and probation. And by the same token, what's going on between probation and the treatment provider. And then lastly, to the extent that it is feasible, as many pre-sentence assessments and evaluations to assist the court in fashioning a sentence. Next slide, please. So some additional thoughts. I think it is extremely helpful. those judges, for example, and those members of DUI treatment court teams or any treatment court teams, they are experts in this area of assessments and treatment. They've been doing it for years. And so certainly they are a resource to this group, to this work group, on what the best evidence-based practices may be. So I think that's something that could be very helpful. I always tell my judicial colleagues, if you want to know about cutting edge reduction of recidivism type techniques, take your drug court judge or your DUI court judge to lunch. So secondly, judicial education. Obviously there are a good group of judges who are experts in this area within the state and around the country, but more and more judicial education about how things have changed, what we've learned over the last couple decades could be very helpful to educating, even longtime judges, but also the newer judges coming on to the bench about effective ways of sentencing impaired drivers. And as I said, better coordination and communication between the judiciary, healthcare, and probation. Next slide, please. So really wrapping up here, to me, there's three essential elements of effective supervision. It's extremely important to monitor behavior and compliance, enforce the conditions of probation, and help those who are under supervision to change their behavior. One of the things I've observed as a drug court judge is very often to become effective, it's important to get that individual clean. We haven't talked about this, but basically clean and sober for at least 30, 60, 90 days. And because at that point they begin to see things very differently. They see changes in themselves. Others see changes. They're more receptive to treatment, so that becomes important. Also, when I talk about enforcing conditions of supervision, we in our traditional courts in Maryland, sometimes there are significant delays between the time that one commits a violation on probation and the time that they finally get back in front of the judge in traditional court. And it could be 2, 3, 4, 5 months after the violation. And we know from the treatment court research, waiting that long to impose some sanction or to try to change behavior is much too long. It's completely ineffective. Next slide, please. So lastly, what evidence-based practices work from my perspective? Clearly, validated risk and needs assessments. And in that regard, I'll just mention briefly, it's important to note that there are risk and needs assessments and there are risk and needs assessments. Some of them are validated for impaired driving. Some of them are not. So it'll be important to identify those that are. Having a reliable assessment and a treatment plan. Having a treatment plan that is tailored to that particular individual. And then whether it's in a treatment court or in a traditional court, increased and ongoing supervision of that individual, of that high-risk impaired driver, clearly works. And I took a little bit out of order, but I'll use it as a lead-in to Jim Eberspacher. But one of the most effective evidence-based practices is the use of DUI or DWI treatment court models that take a team approach to intensively supervising and monitoring and changing behavior of those high-risk impaired drivers, those high-risk and high-need impaired drivers. With that, I'll use that as a lead-in to Jim Eberspacher, and he's going to talk a little bit about DWI courts.
Thanks, Judge. Thanks, Mark, before him. And Judge, I think, that to me, being involved with DUI courts and going around the country and trying to advocate for their expansion and use, that's the mic drop moment. We could probably all just go home. And let's implement DUII courts all around the state of Oregon. If only it were that simple, that'd be great. So I want to talk a little bit of time here. I also want to make sure I leave time if there are questions. So I may speed through some of these things on purpose. So if there's something that you want more about, drop something in the chat. I've been looking at that as we've been going along, and I'll try to go back and cover it in a little more detail. But so I want to start off with talking a little bit about DUI or DUI treatment courts, and as Judge Axel mentioned, it's really an approach for a high-risk, high-need population, and it's a type of court that provides accountability to the impaired driver. It's also a type of court that provides accountability to the system. I'm going to go in a little more detail about what that's about, but I mean, ultimately the goal is, to change behavior. But for participants in these types of programs, our ultimate goal is to help them get covered. A lot of people ask it fairly easy.
Oh, I think we might have lost your mic.
Really?
Your mic came a little loose from you.
Now, we good?
Oh, I think your earpiece.
I'm not talking in the mic.
Oh.
On now.
We can barely hear you. The volume's real low.
Any better?
No. We heard you really well at first. Oh, there we go.
Good. Testing.
Oh.
Go to.
No.
How about now?
Perfect.
Okay, for some reason it changed microphones on me in settings. I don't know why. But anyway, so I don't know what you did or didn't hear, but let's move to the next slide and we'll just keep this thing rolling. So, I'm going to go into more detail about why DUI courts work, but essentially it's they utilize front-end assessments to target a specific population, and they target the population who need long-term treatment, who need the type of supervision to not only provide the accountability, but also as a support mechanism to kind of catch them doing right, which is completely different from what the justice system normally targets people who are coming through the system, and that's targeting things that they're doing wrong so then we can violate them. As an XPO, that was always kind of my job. I had people on my caseload, and I kind of waited for the day where they'd violate, but I'd also try to support them. But ultimately, I spent most of my time working on violations. So they differ in that way where we're really hoping to provide support for them and ultimately to reduce recidivism. Next. So there's some keywords up there about what a DUI court is. And again, stressing the points for a high-risk, high-need population. I'm going to go into detail more about exactly what that means when I start talking about assessments, but it's really a collaborative team approach. It's a wraparound approach to aid a participant in getting the services and making lifelong sustaining changes that they need. The ultimate goal, by providing, frequent alcohol and drug testing, accountability, court monitoring, having them come in to see the judge every week or every other week or monthly as they progress, combining with long-term individualized treatment, intensive supervision. The ultimate goal at the end of the day is recovery. Many, seeing, a lot of service providers here, folks in recovery themselves, or whatever your background may be, recovery is not an easy process. Recovery, that process is different for everybody. And that's one of the good things about DUI courts is that the team approach really aids in determining who, what that journey is going to look like, supporting them in developing the skills, the tools, the things that they now will enjoy out of life to keep them and have these recovery supports, because it takes a long time to get to that point. And in a DUI court, we only have, 12 to 24 months, somewhere around there. And, that's just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to learning and engaging in recovery. And all the really, sustained work happens after they leave. So what DUI courts hope to do, what they try to do, is provide that support, provide the treatment necessary, provide for introduction into recovery, into continuing support once they leave the program, so they don't have to rely on this close-knit team to provide that structure. They then can provide on folks in their own communities, friends, family, support networks to aid in their own recovery journey. Next slide. A little bit about, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on research. It's out there. There's a ton of research on, treatment courts in general, but DUI courts as well. What I will say is, recidivism reduction by an average of 12%. Let me just explain briefly where that comes from. That's not a huge number, right? It's still a reduction, but I like to argue that's not a huge number at the end of the day. And the research that comes out of that, where they got that average, combined a lot of research that wasn't great, and on some programs who weren't really following the model. Where we really see the research for jurisdictions who are following the DUI court model according to the 10 guiding principles, according to adult drug court best practice standards, they're reducing general recidivism by 50 to 60%, sometimes even more. And if we focus specifically on impaired driving recidivism, it's even greater than that. So, and I think the next slide expands on that a little bit. So let's go there. Various studies down around the country. One of the ones I'll focus on is the one in the middle from Minnesota. I'm a little biased being from Minnesota, but there was some great research coming out of there about the 9 DUI courts. Those that focused on high-risk individuals had better outcomes, including significant reductions in recidivism. Again, that's general recidivism. Similar studies, similar outcomes in Michigan, Georgia, pretty much states where you see folks following the model, you're going to find these kinds of numbers. Next slide. As Mark, started off by depressing us all about crashes and fatalities, it's great that we want to reduce recidivism. It's good for the individual, it's good for the communities, saves money. But what about lives, right? So we also want to make sure we're measuring when we do outcome studies that they're actually decreasing crashes, right? And there's a study in San Joaquin, California, a number of years ago that found they were cutting crashes, in half over a period of 18 months. And they've been able to extrapolate that out, and they're still finding it's reducing crashes, which ultimately is going to reduce fatalities for this population. Next slide. Cost isn't that big a deal either. It saves money when you compare it with interventions, like if you want to call jail or prison an intervention, I'm using the term loosely. It's cheaper and less expensive to put somebody in a DUI court than it is for that. And then your long-term outcomes by reduction of recidivism, when you factor in victimization numbers and the reduction there, you factor in reduced emergency room visits, reduced treatment episodes, reduced enforcement, and on the back end, we're ultimately saving money because these people aren't coming back into the system any longer. Next slide. So the reasons for success, and all three of us, I think, have alluded to a number of these. Again, it's the team approach. It's the close supervision, it's accountability on both ends. And one of the key takeaways, it's that close coordination, not only between treatment and supervision, but with the judicial system. It's all three of these services coming together to make sure nothing's missed. So often, speaking as an ex-probation officer, so often my caseload sizes were so large, I just simply couldn't provide the kinds of referrals, the kinds of case management that I should have to everybody, especially when you look at DUI caseloads. And I think Mark mentioned this, they're some of the largest caseloads for probation in the country. I mean, for some reason, us as a system have decided that they're not that big a deal, even though they pose the greatest public safety risk in our community. They're not that big a deal. So we'll put 200 people on DUIs to one probation officer. How much work, what's the expectation of real rehabilitation, real behavior change when you can't manage 200 people effectively? So it's a close coordination and kind of breaking down the silos that so often occur in the system. Coordination between treatment telling the court what's going on in treatment to the extent that they can, according to 42 CFR and HIPAA compliance. But it's engaging everybody to make sure we're understanding what the individual needs for support, where they're headed, and how to continue to assist them moving down that track. Next slide. You can actually click on all these. Thank you, Marsha. So DUI courts are great, right? I started off by saying if we could do it for everybody, perfect, but they're not right for everybody that comes into the system. So when we look at kind of the bubbles of categories for impaired drivers, if we start off with the larger one, we think about everybody, first timers to somebody with their 15, right? There's a wide range of behaviors. There's a wide range of, substance use disorder levels. There's, wide ranges of need for treatment, mental health issues. So there's a lot of things at play here. And so to think that we're going to treat everybody in that bubble with one intervention doesn't really make a lot of common sense. So we got to start narrowing it down. So then when we look at first timers, and Mark talked about this, 2/3 of them correct on their own. Right. So if we start putting them into interventions that are far more intrusive in their lives, when already kind of the shame and the hit on their pocketbook and maybe the impact on their job loss or their family embarrassment, they self-correct for whatever reason. And so we have to be careful about what we do with them. The other two bubbles that we have are repeaters. So 2+. And folks driving around with significant levels of blood alcohol concentration, twice the legal limit or higher. So when we're looking at those two bubbles, those are the folks Mark was talking about that have the greatest impact in terms of crashes, fatalities, dollar amounts that we spend on enforcement in the judicial system. Those are the greatest impact on our society. So many of our interventions in the system, being it from messaging, prevention, to enforcement, to prosecution, to judicial interventions, so much of what we do is front end heavy, right? And by example, 0.05 is a front end intervention. Let's lower the legal limit and see what the impact is in terms of, reducing impaired driving and reducing crashes and fatalities. I'm not arguing that it's not a good strategy. My argument is that we have so much on the front end, not everybody gets corrected on the front end. So we've got to do something to provide something on the back end as well. So if we're looking at kind of these two bubbles who kind of make the most damage, the most impact in our communities, the ones creating the greatest public safety risk, that's likely who DUI court is for. Next. Perhaps somewhere along the line, you've heard of R&R, risk need responsivity. And Nicole actually set us up really well for this presentation because she hit a lot of the same topics and buzzwords that we carried throughout this presentation. And I'll there's a lot on this slide. And so I'll give it to you in a nutshell. Risk need responsivity really is looking at the who, what, and the how of the people coming into the system, right? So when we look at the who, we're looking at risk. We want to match the intensity of the the intervention to the risk of reoffending. So the higher risk somebody is, the more intensive the intervention. It's kind of 1-to-1. Next is the what. What does the person who's coming into the system look like? What are their criminogenic needs? What are their do they have antisocial behaviors? Do they have a substance use disorder? If so, are they at risk? Are they moderate to severe substance use disorder? Do they present with other mental health issues? Do they have criminogenic peers? So all this kind of goes into play to determine what criminogenic needs we also want to pay attention to, because those are essentially affecting their risk and their risk to continue to reoffend. So as a system, we have to figure out how to tailor the intervention to match that person's needs, to match that person's learning style, their level of motivation, culture, demographics, their cognitive functioning. I think it was Jose in the chat made a couple of comments about ethnicity and culture, and that absolutely goes into play in terms of responsivity. I mean, to put people into interventions that they feel no value in, that they're getting no value in, that doesn't really pertain to their lifestyle or their culture or their familiar history, it's not going to be good for them. I mean, maybe it might work short term, but really for them to connect and connect with treatment and connect and get into recovery, we have to figure out how to tailor all of those interventions and all these pieces to provide that wraparound approach to kind of give them the step up, right? So we're responding in an individual way, but those individual responsivity needs can be done within a particular program. Next slide. So briefly about risk principle, a lot of times we like to think of risk as, people we're really afraid of, risk of violence or dangerousness, but it goes beyond that. Risk also means folks who continue to fail other interventions consistently, right? It was really common for me to have somebody on probation over and over and over and over, right? But yet we'll continue to put them on probation and provide the same things over and over and over, expecting a different result. Again, foolishness, doesn't make a lot of sense. We're not really tailoring an intervention to that. Again, and when we focus the higher the risk level, the more intensive supervision should be, the more intensive accountability is, the more that we're going to pay attention and focus on those specific risks, and vice versa. Lesser the risk, lesser the intervention, right? And the last thing I'll say about that is that we also want to make sure, and I think it's the last bullet, we want to make sure that we're not mixing risk levels, right? So when I talked about DUI court being for a high risk, high need population, if we start putting people who are low risk into that same population, guess what? We don't make the high risk people better or lower risk. It's the other way. The lower risk people learn really valuable ways of that high risk population. They become high risk themselves. Unfortunately, it doesn't work the other way. Next slide. And we'll talk about need principle. Talking about clinical syndromes, disorders, and again, it's similar to risk in that the higher the need level, the more intensive the services need to be. The more intensive treatment should be, the more intensive rehabilitation services should be. But we focus a lot on risk assessments and risk need assessments, and a lot of it has to do with probation. But we'd be remiss if we didn't also talk about, we don't really know what treatment should be for folks unless we're doing clinical evaluations and clinical assessments on folks. Full biopsychosocial assessments to really understand what they present with according to ASAM criteria, what their level of care needs to be, whether that's outpatient, inpatient, intensive outpatient, residential, and figuring out on an individual basis what they need in those services, right? It's not a cookie cutter approach in treatment either. It shouldn't be. If you're using treatment services that provide the same thing for every single person that comes in, something needs to change about that too, because not only does the system intervention need to be responsive, treatment needs to be responsive to specific needs. and provide the services at a level of care that that person needs, and something that's also meaningful, whether that's culture, whether that's gender, whatever the case may be. Next slide. I want to focus a little bit on intent versus impact. I want to spend a little bit of time on this. So I think it's, I talked about it and Judge Axel talked about it, and pretty sure Mark mentioned it too. If he didn't, he owes me $1. We too often provide a cookie cutter approach to everybody that comes into the system. We're really, really good at that, and historically for impaired drivers, right? We'll latch onto an idea, something that looks great in the research or something that we think is good with no research, and anybody that comes in, boom, everybody goes into that program. We may actually be doing harm for folks, or may not be impacting them whatsoever. So let's kind of whittle these down, right? If we look at treatment alone, if somebody comes into the system and presents with a treatment need and they need to go to treatment, whatever level of care it may be, a lot of times a great percentage don't even ever get the assessment done, right? And those that do, the likelihood that they actually go to treatment once even drops off further. And those that stay in it even drops off further. So we're continuing to whittle it down for people who don't get that intervention if we think we're just going to put them in the treatment. I think Judge Axel mentioned there's some coercion effect that definitely helps people stay in treatment. They always have a choice of whether or not they're going to go to treatment, right? They don't want to go to treatment as part of a DUI court or as part of some other programming that they've been sentenced to. They have other options: jail, incarceration, maybe something else, but giving them the idea of what treatment looks like, giving hopefully that they're in there long enough that they begin to understand it and value that what's been going on hasn't been working for them, and they clearly do have a need for treatment and they have difficulties, whether that's risky behavior to severe substance use disorder. We hope to introduce the idea of treatment, but we often need, kind of, as I mentioned, those supervision components along with it. So let's take it even a step further. We can put people on intensive supervision, but when we talk about caseload sizes, a lot of them will take their chances, right? Sure, I'll be on probation. I may get tested, once a month, maybe, and I'll use the entire time while I'm on probation. And when I know testing's coming up, guess what? I'll stop a couple days before I'll get clear. Combining all these approaches is really the best approach. I presented at it was like a sales convention for an ignition interlock provider a few years ago, and they had kind of this keynote event, and they had a DUI court graduate from someone in that state, and he spoke, and one of the things he said, I think, really rings true. He said, no amount of supervision, no amount of jail, no amount of ignition interlock, no amount of house arrest was going to change my behavior, right? He said, it wasn't until I got into a DUI court where all of this was used to change my behavior and give me the treatment that I needed. That's what made the impact, right? He said, I was good at being drunk, right? He'd get up drunk, he'd go to work drunk, he'd go to, he'd take his kids to school impaired. He was really good at doing that, right? So nothing was going to change him until somebody and the system was able to kind of control and look at and assist him with every aspect of his life and keep him in treatment long enough where he understood and became well, right? And then introduce him into a lifestyle recovery. Incarceration, unfortunately, let me start by saying this. Incarceration has its place, right? The jail and prison is useful in certain cases. The idea, the notion that we're going to jail our way out of the impaired driving issue is utter nonsense. We don't keep people in jail or prison on a DUI forever, right? It's very rare unless it's something related to a fatality or serious bodily injury where someone stays in jail or prison long enough that we've kind of, okay, take care of public safety, done. They get out at some point. If we haven't addressed the root causes for their behavior, for their use, their mental health issues, they're going to continue that. It may not be right away, may not be as soon as they get out, may not be a month later, but you can better believe a year, 2 years, 5 years down the road, they're going to go back to that same lifestyle at some point. And again, DUI courts, I'll talk about them and I'll, shout from the rooftops about how great they are. But again, it's for a specific population. And I have some research about putting the wrong people into a DUI court and the kind of damage it can do. Next slide. Real briefly about this, because again, I was hoping to save some for questions, and I think I got a little winded on a few of those points. But some of you may have heard of screening and brief intervention and referral to treatment, or SBIRT for short. It is really was created as an early intervention for people with risky alcohol use, right? The idea is that we screen people to identify risky behavior for developing further substance use disorders, provide intervention to raise awareness, provide education for them, determine level of motivation for change, where they're at, and kind of that cycle. In the stages of change, set up healthier goals. If they need treatment, it's there, boom, we can assess them and put people into services quickly. Next slide. One jurisdiction that started this, created a pilot, Duluth, Minnesota. And what they did a number of years ago really took a system-wide approach. It was led by their DUI court judge, Judge Sean Flurkey, at the time, and he had a DUI court in Duluth, Minnesota. When they started DUI court, they targeted felony level impaired drivers, and in Minnesota, that was 4 DUIs within 10 years as felony level, right? The riskiest, high risk, impaired drivers that come into the system. So though he knew he was making an impact there, it wasn't enough. Right, we were still missing some front end people, some people who maybe first timers or second timers or whatever the case may be. It wasn't enough that he got to them on their 4th. He wanted to get them into services if they needed it on their 1st. So he got all stakeholders together: law enforcement, probation, treatment, prosecution, defense, pretty much anybody that's impacted or challenged by this issue. So they created this team approach, and the idea was that they would assess all first-time impaired drivers within a few weeks of their arrest, and ultimately they did it within a couple of days. And they provided an assessment, and I can give you more about this if you're interested later on about exactly what they used and kind of some of the numbers. But what they found is complete system improvement. When they were front end recognizing folks within a few days after their arrest, those who needed treatment, right, which normally we would miss on a first timer, the 1/3 that Mark talked about that didn't self-correct, but we don't know it until they get their second, or those with risky behaviors who maybe needed some self-awareness about these issues and how it could become a greater problem. Self-reported appreciation from the people that they were assessing, really excellent kind of involvement and continued involvement for people following up with assessment and then going to treatment. And out of the group that they were studying in this pilot, none had committed a second DUI. So again, it could have been some of these people could have been the 2/3 that self-correct, but what we don't know is how many of the 1/3 that they actually were able to provide services on that front end that didn't get their second. Next slide. List of assessments, right? What I'll say about this, and Judge Axel mentioned it, we need to make sure with this population that we're using validated assessments. like we've been saying, assessments is also not a one-size-fits-all approach. There are assessments created for certain populations within the justice system. DWIs are no different. The IDA, the two at the bottom, impaired driver assessment, and CARS, the computerized assessment and referral system, those two have been normed for the population. Great thing about this, both of them are free. Both of them are web-based. You've got the guy, Mark, who's the expert on the IDA. So if you want more information about that or you want to use it, grab Mark and bend his ear. He'd be happy to come to your jurisdiction and teach you all about it. And CARS is an online kind of self-taught tool. I'd be happy, so would Mark, to connect you with folks or provide more information about that. There's also a screening tool normed for a DUI population. It's called the risk and need triage, DUI. So there's a risk and need triage, and then there's a risk and need triage for DUI population. What that does, it's really cool. It's quick and easy. It's designed to determine risk and need and puts people into certain quadrant categories. So you could then tailor your interventions to meet those specific needs according to risk and need. It's pretty fantastic. But you want to make sure you follow up that screening with an assessment. And if they're presenting as high need, following up with a clinical assessment by trained clinical professionals who can do that. Next slide. Briefly about risk areas of DWI recidivism. Clearly, prior involvement in the justice system, specifically related to impaired driving, but also non-DUI involvement. Some might be traffic, some may be general recidivism. We want to make sure we understand who this person is and their complete involvement in the system. We want to know that it aids to determine, where are they at? Is all of their behavior related to impaired driving, or are they involved in other risky behaviors as well? Prior involvement with alcohol and other drugs, mental health and mood adjustment problems, resistance to current involvement. I talked about past failures, right? And it might be resistance to that. It might be non-compliance. It just might be didn't work for them, or they skated on it, or they just didn't care. There are a lot of different issues and how to address that. But those are the major risk areas for DWI recidivism. Next slide. So then we talk about criminogenic factors. Mark talked and briefly touched on antisocial cognitions or antisocial behavior. When you think for a moment about the habitual behavior of impaired driving, Mark talked about 80 times, 200 times before they're ever caught, right? Think about the cognition or the lack of cognition about using alcohol or any other drug and continually getting behind the wheel of a car with disregard for anybody and everybody around them, right? And it happens in every community. That's a pretty heightened level of antisocial behavior, right? It's a developed pattern for them. Messaging is lost on them. It's like the guy I told you about who spoke at that conference. Didn't matter. He didn't care who else was around him. Nothing was going to stop him from using. Nothing was going to stop him from driving, right? So he was going to continue those behaviors without a type of intervention. Completely antisocial. So when we look at responding to some of that, we want to make sure our interventions, if they've got some of this criminal thinking, there are criminal thinking programs like Thinking for a Change, MRT. There are others who focus on changing kind of that mental thought and this antisocial behavior in terms of this criminogenic thinking pattern. Other risk factors, and a lot of times you won't see some of these with your impaired drivers, family issues, marital discord, their leisure and recreation might revolve a lot around alcohol, but they might actually have hobbies and things that they're involved in. Just because somebody's on a softball team might actually be the worst thing for them because most of them booze up right afterwards. So paying attention to maybe they have hobbies and maybe they have things that they're doing, but they may not be all that great supportive hobbies, and we need to also change that. Level of schooling, whether or not they have a job skills, and then again, of course, substance use. All of these go into play in terms of determining kind of those risk factors and things that we're going to respond to in terms of responsivity and determining their needs. Next slide. mental health. And when we look at mental health over, the past 6 or 7 years, I'd say we've really taken this issue to the forefront of impaired drivers, especially with repeaters. There's a lot of research out there now that shows about half of your repeat impaired drivers are coming into the system with at least one diagnosed lifetime mental health disorder: anxiety, PTSD, depression, antisocial, and unfortunately, a lot of times treatment, unless they're a co-occurring provider, they may not be assessing for that. They may not have the services to kind of hone in on those mental health issues, right? If we're not treating, and I keep saying this, and I say it because it bears repeating all the time, if we're not addressing all the aspects of the person presenting in front of us, we're missing something, and the likelihood that they're going to achieve lifetime success isn't as great as if we treat the entire person. So we want to make sure we're also screening and assessing for mental health. CARS is a great tool to do that, as it was developed as a mental health assessment. It's a risk assessment secondarily, but it really gives you a good glimpse of what somebody might be presenting with in terms of lifetime and past year mental health issues. And so we have to make sure not only are we assessing, we have clinical assessments for substance use disorder. Those have to include everything in that person: health history, mental health, so on and so forth. Next slide. Let's skip to polysubstance use slide, which I think is 2 ahead of us. And as we get there, one back. There we go. Polysubstance use when it comes to impaired driving is and has been really on the rise. A lot of it, unfortunately, we have some data. It's not good data everywhere. Some states are really excellent at collecting the data. Mark talked about a lot of times enforcement or prosecution stops at when you get the 0.08 or higher, and when you detect impairment with alcohol. And unfortunately, that's created an issue in really determining drugs that are on board. What I'll say kind of as a closing statement about this: impaired driving is not an alcohol issue any longer. Used to be years and years ago. That was our focus. Unfortunately, where we're at now is we're kind of at ground zero in terms of attitudes and perceptions, especially around marijuana and impaired driving and its impact on our ability to operate a vehicle, right? So what I'll say is that when you look at tailoring the intervention, whatever it might be for the person in front of you, we want to focus on the behavior of impaired driving as opposed to the drug of choice. We can't say this person's got alcohol, so we put them here, or this person's in drug impaired driver, so we're going to put them in drug court. Focus on the behavior of impaired driving and give them to the people who know and understand and are best apt to serve and provide resources for impaired drivers. Addiction's a disease, and drug of choice is a moving target. You may think you're testing for alcohol because that's the person that came in, at a 0.15 on their arrest. Guess what? It's not the only thing that they're using, right? And if it is right now, once you start testing them for that, and because their substance use disorder is so severe and they can't stop without intervention and continuous monitoring and support, they're going to start finding things to continue that addiction, right? So focus on the behavior, provide the long-term treatment that they need with qualified professionals. Next slide. Improving supervision outcomes. Again, we're assessing needs. Intrinsic motivation. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because I want to, again, I talked about wanting questions. So let's just keep going. Next slide. One thing we'll say, I'll say about this. You come into the system, if you've ever involved in the system on the other side, there's a lot of fines and fees that go into being convicted of something, especially around DUI. It's expensive, right? And so when we start lopping on court fees, we start lopping on probation fees, attorney fees, insurance rates are going, ignition interlock and other technologies are costing the person something, treatment might cost them something, maybe they have insurance, maybe they don't, keeps wrapping up, right? And so these costs keep building and building. The point about that is we don't want to set people up for failure. We have to have an out for people with indigency issues who are lower on the socioeconomic scale. They need the same kinds of availability and opportunities to participate and receive the interventions that we afford for everybody, whether or not they can pay for it or not, right? So we also, as a system, have to figure out how to stop lopping fines and fees on folks and these exorbitant costs to keep people from accessing the services that they truly need. Next slide. Let's go to fidelity to the model slide, Marisha. Quickly, and this has to do with fidelity of the model. If you look at this is a research out of Minnesota. The 9 courts, they looked at graduates in their DUI courts. They looked at everybody who went through DUI court, whether or not they were successful or they were terminated. And then they compared them with folks who didn't get to DUI court, who didn't have that intervention. They may have went to jail. They may have went to standard probation. Maybe they had treatment, maybe not. Maybe they had other kinds of technology. If you look at this, and you can click, I think, one more, Marisha. There's 3 courts here that stand out. Court 1, 4, and 8. Courts 1 and 4, when you looked at everybody in a DUI court, whether they were successful or not, actually had no impact and actually had little worse outcomes. They recidivated at a higher rate than the comparison group. Court 8, their graduates in DUI court recidivated at nearly twice as much as the comparison group. So what's our takeaway from that? Our takeaway is, out of all these courts, some of the things that we learned from this research is they were putting low-risk people into this kinds of program. They weren't testing people adequately. Treatment was poor. Their assessments were poor. They essentially weren't keeping the fidelity of the model, and they were applying an intervention that people did not need. And Court 8 essentially were making people worse by doing that. They're mixing low-risk people with high-risk people, and that makes people worse. So again, fidelity of the model is critical with whatever intervention you're putting folks into. With that, I think I turn it back over to Mark.
So next slide. Just recognizing that you have to look at the individual, and we can't be doing cookie cutter approach in working with this population. So the 3 of us have tossed a whole lot of information at you, and I know that you're, relatively speaking, kind of in the early stages of your work here. So I will tell you, if there is anything you need from us moving forward, we are more than happy to provide you whatever you need. But I wanted to see, are there any questions? Is there anything that the 3 of us can try to answer before you take your break? Going once, going twice.
Mark, let me throw in something real quickly, just as a thought, as this group is moving forward, in light of some of what Jim's comments were, and you can't just treat the alcohol, you have to treat all the drugs. One of the challenges in Oregon, and I would refer you to Judge Bergstrom, he could go into greater detail, but being able to fashion supervision with restrictions against the use of other substances may become a very significant issue. There's some cases in the last couple of years out of the courts in Oregon dealing with one who has a medical marijuana card and whether one can be prohibited from using medical marijuana with a valid card. That may have a very significant impact on treatment. And so I just throw that out. You all may want to take a look at that, and maybe it's something subject to legislative change, maybe it's something to deal with, but it's a very real issue cropping up around the country.
Marisha, if you could click the last slide, our contact information should be there. So feel free to send an email or just get in touch with us, and we're more than happy to provide anything that you need. And I wish you luck. I wish other states were taking a deep dive like you are in dealing with this population.
Thank you all so much. This has been fantastic information. I am sure that we absolutely will be reaching out to you for more information, especially about the IDA and cars. Again, thank you all so much. We really appreciate you being here, and look forward to talking with you again in the future.
All right. Best of luck to all of you.
Thank you. Thank you for all that you're doing.
Thank you.
All right, so we'll go ahead and take a break. Come back at 10 after. Go stretch your legs, get a drink of water, something like that. We'll be back shortly to set our ongoing meeting schedule.
Is anybody else on here?
Yes. Hi.
Yeah. Can you hear us, Justin?
I can. I just stepped away for a second, so I noticed that the presenters had left, so I was just checking back in.
Yeah, we're on a 10-minute break.
All righty. Oh, so that was a lot of information to take in, a lot of really good information. I'll be sending out the handouts from the PowerPoint, so you guys have that all to kind of digest after the meeting, go over it again, and really let it sink in, to dig into our work starting with our next meeting. So speaking of our next meeting, when we were looking at the structure of this work group, we kind of envisioned monthly meetings, and obviously if we're going to do monthly meetings, they need to be 2 to 3 hours. So but definitely would leave that decision to the work group. How do folks feel about that moving forward? Does this day and time work for folks? Are there better days at work? And yeah, so I'll just kind of throw that out for feedback from folks, and then we'll dig into figuring it all out.
Works for me, Marisha.
Okay.
This is Mark Patterson. Thursdays at this time work great.
Perfect. Anybody that this was a huge hardship for to be here at this time? Well,
Marisha,
this was
Eric
way
Bergstrom.
easier than I thought it was going to be, considering how many folks we had. Okay,
Hey,
so
Marisha, this is Eric. I don't know if you can hear me.
yes.
We're starting to open court back up, so it's really unclear what our court schedule will look like, but I'll try to work around it.
Perfect. And these meetings will absolutely be recorded, ongoing, and posted. So if you're not able to be at a meeting, definitely will be able to view it. So, all right.
And Marisha, this is Justin, and I'm actually going to be out of town next month during the week of, let's see, like the 12th. So like if like the week after that, the 19th or the 26th, that would be available.
That would be perfect. It looks so if we do the third Thursday of the month, that would be the 19th in August.
Yeah, that would be great if we could, this is Heather, if we could make them like that, like the third Thursday, so it's regularly scheduled and it'd be really easy. And then too, I know for me, like if I have to miss, it would be great if we had materials like a week early so that we could provide feedback to give to you if we weren't able to make it or something. That would be super helpful, depending on what the agenda is for that day.
Yeah, absolutely can commit to that.
And this is Justin again, Marisha. I was wondering if you could just speak briefly, provide us an overview of maybe what the goal is of the meeting, some objectives, and some things that we're going to be doing moving forward.
With the information prior to the meetings?
No, I meant like as a group as a whole. What is our, like, define our purpose?
Oh, gotcha.
And what specifically is our objectives as a group?
That is a great lead in, and both of those will happen. So we're going to talk more about the focus and the outcomes that we're looking from this group now. And then in preparation for each meeting, we'll have, at the end of the meeting, we'll identify here's what needs to be done before the next meeting, come prepared to do this, and we'll send out all the materials in advance of the meetings and that sort of thing. So, so let me open this document. So we attached a few documents to the meeting appointment today, just so folks would have them in case of technical difficulties. Not necessarily, didn't expect you guys to review them and have them memorized or anything like that prior to the meeting. So let me pull up the workshop area profile and share my screen so folks can see that. Okay, can folks see my screen? Yep. Okay. All right. Yes. So this is a draft, and this is actually an action item for today's meeting to review this prior to our next meeting. Just wanted to kind of introduce it today as a draft. So what this does is talks about the DUI Services Modernization Workgroup and really what we're looking for from this group. So the key objectives are to review the current research that we just heard about, the evidence-based practices for reducing DUI recidivism. And then over the next several meetings, we're also going to be talking about the feedback that we've received through lots of different ways, just communications with providers and ADISs and community partners, as well as our formal listening sessions and focus groups that we did. Really, bring in all of that information, let you guys know what we've heard through that process, and then also give you guys an opportunity to fill any spots that are missing from that feedback. Taking all of that information, then looking at our current system and identifying areas where improvements can and should be made. So we're not going to be getting into the details of exactly what steps to take to fix everything, but get some general consensus of where we want to move forward. So this group will be identifying the destination, perhaps not necessarily the route we'll take to get there. There'll be other work groups and such moving forward, more specific targeted work groups around different parts of the system, but to get some consensus moving forward of the major changes, or major system initiatives that need to take place in order to move our system to a more evidence-based system like the judge and Mark and Jim spoke about.
Marisha, this is Heather.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question? So when we do this, will we have a chance to kind of, those are great large bullet heads, but kind of maybe discuss, like, are we going to make space for discussing best practices for the different segments? Actually, that was nicely presented today of first-time folks that, what does that look like versus folks who have recidivism, and what does that look like, and what are the best practices under that? And then I assume we will do best practices look at based on both the criminal justice interaction and the treatment interaction, and then also culturally specific indicators. So we'll have time to kind of beef those out a little bit in the agenda.
Yeah, definitely going to be looking at, what are the services, like they talked about the low risk, low need folks. What do those services need to look like, as opposed to what do the services need to look like for more high risk repeat DUI offenders? Definitely that's a huge piece of really what we need to take a look at within our system, not just from what we've seen on my end, but also all the feedback that we've received is that the kind of one size fits all is not working. And we heard from the presenters as well. The one thing I do want to be really clear about is the scope of our project. So we're looking at the system that OHA oversees. So it's the screening, referral, monitoring process under the ADISs. It's the DUI education and rehabilitation process. We don't oversee the victim impact panels, court sanctions, administrative sanctions. Those pieces, while they definitely play into the service structure, those are kind of outside of our scope and authority. So we're really looking at the services and supports that OHA has oversight for.
Marisha, this is Justin again. I just feel it's an appropriate time to be, candid with you and the members, is that I didn't really, I guess my expectation was that we would really be doing a thorough audit and examination of the current OARs, and then that would lead to a broader discussion of kind of what's working and what's not working related to different systems inside the DUI process. So it sounds like the answer to, one of the first questions as far as the objective goes was to examine the feedback that OHA has already gotten. And so I just fear that we would spend our time kind of regurgitating and revisiting the same feedback that you already have. So I think that since you have a group of professionals made up of many different stakeholders in the DUI process, from probation to judiciary, treatment, and the ADIS, it might be more effective and valuable for OHA to talk specifically to those entities and what's working in their part of the processes and what's not, to come up with a more pinpoint yet collaborative approach and comprehensive.
Yeah, and I think that our goals are similar in that, Justin. We definitely won't be recreating the wheel with the information from the stakeholder groups and the feedback. It's really more to make sure that to identify, here's what we've heard, not to recreate all of that, but to list out, here's what we've heard. Is there anything that we've missed? Really, it's another opportunity to make sure that we're looking at everything, and then take that information to do what you're talking about and identify, okay, where is this not working in the system? What do we need to do to address that? And what are the evidence-based practices that fit into that piece? So I think we're all on the same board with that. It might just be a little different terminology. Definitely the same roadmap and objectives.
This is me, Robert. I was wondering, someone talked about ballot measure 110. Are we going to discuss the impacts of ballot measure 110, or is that for another group?
So specifically related to ballot measure 110, there's a huge work group and process around that, the Oversight and Accountability Council. There definitely is intersection with the work that we do in with DUI services. It's been talked about several months now at the Governor's Advisory Council, and I'm sure in many other places, the concern that we may start to see an increase in controlled substance DUIs. And polysubstance DUIs as well. And so that's definitely something we want to take a look at. And also making sure that our programming is appropriate for those types of situations. So so that we're not just focusing on alcohol. And I certainly don't think that our providers are doing that now, but making sure that we're making more of an intentional focus on that, and including that polysubstance use information. Yeah.
So Marisha, this is Justin again. I'm sorry. I just, moving forward, I just want to be very clear, because I mean, my time is extremely valuable, just like everybody else on the committee. So I want to make sure that my participation and my input is going to be, valued, because I've been to plenty of RAC committees and, with other treatment providers, and we in the past have made suggestions, and historically, the state, it does what they want to do. And even though we provide, suggestions and feedback, I just want to know from you what you're going to do with our suggestions.
So the feedback from the suggestions from this work group will go directly to leadership through our chain of command, my supervisor, Nicole, her supervisor, Leticia Sains, and our ultimate supervisor, Steve Allen, Margie, and Pat. So the feedback will go directly to leadership, who ultimately have the decision about what to move forward on. It's not me making those ultimate decisions, but the information and all the recommendations from this work group will go directly to HSD leadership for final decision making.
Yeah, and this is Nicole. Just to be clear, we're not going to edit or water down or somehow change the feedback. That's why we want all of your opinions. This is a representative sampling of people who do this work, are impacted by the work, and we are striving to address health inequities, right? That's OHA's goal, and have evidence-based and effective services. So we want to co-create this with this group.
This is Joseph. Martina, I have a question.
Yeah.
I recognize that the focus of this is to reduce recidivism for DUII and look at the different types of people who are at high risk or not at high risk, and how that'll be addressed. But I can't help but to feel that preventative measures would be extremely beneficial. And I'm I'm looking for personally, I'm willing to be a part of this in whatever capacity that is, but personally, I'm looking for ways to learn from each other and better provide the services within the county. I'm glad that this is going to affect the bigger picture, but I'm also looking at the little picture and wondering how that might be instituted. And I hope that's a part of what we do as well.
And Joseph, do you mean preventing first-time DUIs?
Yes. Every time I do a DUII group, one of the statements that I hear from better than 50% of the participants is, I wish I would have known this information before.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I mean, and I'm sure we'll talk about that. The part of the system that we're in, though, the folks have already gotten that DUI. I agree 100% with the statement around better prevention. And definitely, you know, that's information that we can share. You know, Justin, as a member of the Governor's Advisory Council, can help bring that information back to the members there. Heather can bring it to other members of the behavioral health community. You know, we all can help share in that increased information. But the system that we're looking at really is focused on, these are folks who have already gotten that DUI. How do we make sure that they don't get another one?
Thank you. I do understand that. I just can't help but to feel that if we always look for problems that we need to fix rather than problems that we can prevent. But I hear you loud and clear.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I can hook you up with some folks over at Public Health who do more of that preventative work in the injury prevention unit. I'd be happy to connect you with those folks.
Thank you.
And this is Nicole again. I do want to be clear and respectful of the point that Marisha made about our scope, which is, you know, this is an OHA-led work group. We are only in control of what OHA is in control of, but we can certainly give this information. I mean, DUI is that interesting thing that intersects with so many different areas, right? We obviously intersect with the court system, and as our presenters all just explained to you, there's so much control of effective practices happening in the courts. So we want to share our feedback and recommendations with the courts and with the DMV, like we were just talking about with public health, because that's where prevention happens, right? This is, you know, social norms around alcohol and other drug use and driving are a huge part of what has an impact on you know, whether or not people are actually in this situation. So I want us to do good work with that which is in our control, but then we can also plant seeds and provide support and information to the other areas that and other parts of the system that impact this population.
Yeah. Heather, did you have a question?
No, I just was thinking about the stakeholder groups and just what Nicole was saying there, and what's being brought up by the other members of the work group, and so I'm glad to hear that I think it sounds like there's a lot of cohesion around the vision of what the work group members and all these other activities that have happened. Just probably having we'll just have to figure out how we do the structure and how we, in the order of operations of how to bring up the recommendations and then how we table them and all of those kinds of things. Because I think this group probably, I mean, there's a really great representation of a variety of folks with a variety of experience across the DUI system and treatment system in general. And I think there could be some really interesting things that come out around early intervention that could lead to discourse around prevention. And thank you for being willing to take that to your other division partners at OHA as they come up. You know, because even with first-time folks, you know, there are probably practices that we're missing opportunities, like many folks who get a first-time DUI, perhaps are parents, and what kind of information could be made available to them that's culture changing, right? Just like they talked about with wearing a seatbelt or culture change around drinking and driving is not okay. And so there's lots of intersections of where different opportunities for education information could be leveraged in really interesting way that I'm sure our providers have a lot of thoughts about. Even specifically culturally appropriate and sensitive ones. So I just think it's like, I think about my family background, Ukrainian, and if there was some things about how to talk about things with your kids or all of these kinds of things, that would be something that would be receptive in that setting, and otherwise they may not have exposure to, because it's not really a community that's going to go necessarily seek SUD treatment. Yeah, because it's not. Yeah. So anyway, just some thoughts around some of these kinds of things. I think it's an exciting opportunity. Sorry.
Yeah, no, those are great points. And I just want to point out the message here in the chat about talking about medical marijuana, and that is absolutely one of the things we need to talk about. That is an elephant in the room that we definitely need to talk about and address, and think about how we move forward around that. We'll get into this in more detail in future sessions, but that's definitely not just a piece that OHA has control over. So definitely, but that is absolutely on the list of things that not only has been identified as a need internally, but has very much been identified from our stakeholders, our community partners, clients, courts, just everybody involved. Yeah.
So Marisha, this is Justin again. One of my previous conversations with Nicole, so sorry, Nicole, I'm putting you on the spot, but I remember that you had said that there were, some OARs, some processes inside the DUII system that were quote unquote antiquated. So my question specifically is, with this feedback, I know, Marisha, you answered my other question about what are you going to do with the information. So when it goes possibly all the way up to the director of OHA, is it your goal to revamp the DUI OARs, or what are you going to do specifically with that information?
So Marisha's nodding, and I will hop in also. Yes, that's the whole point of the work here, right? We want to change the OARs that are not working. We want to improve the system, fix the stuff that's old and broken, enhance the stuff that's working well, and we want this group of experts to help us identify what needs to be changed and how those changes what exactly those changes should be. That's our purpose for being here.
Yeah.
So I'm really glad to hear you say that, Nicole, because that was my understanding, of joining the committee. If OARs are going to be changed, I just think, again, it would make sense to do an audit of the DUI OARs as they are in its current form and go from there of what's working and what's not working and what's being addressed and what needs to be addressed. That it needs to be updated, but it requires a review of our current system.
Yeah, and so that's exactly what this work group will help inform, is where the areas of administrative rule need to be changed. But it's not just administrative rule that needs to be changed. Some of this is also statutory changes that are necessary to take place in order for those rule revisions to take place. So it's not just rules, there's also statutes that are involved. And so based on the recommendations from this group, like XYZ rule needs to be changed, then we'll move forward with the rule change process, which involves rule advisory committees, which involve public hearings, all of that kind of stuff. So while we won't be changing the actual rules within this work group, the recommendations will be made from this group about what administrative rules need to be looked at and changed moving forward. And part of that recommendation could be a systematic line-by-line review of all of the administrative rules. But so that's what we're here to take a look at and move forward with. Yes, when rules are changed without prior research, entire communities are absolutely. And one of the things that I really want to point out is that what a lot of the information that was shared today by our presenters is new information, like information that's come out since the last rule revisions were done. The last time we did rule revisions, the best information we had was the meta-analysis done in 2014 that basically says throw everything at the wall and hope something sticks. that was the best information that we've had. Now we have a lot more information. Now we have a validated tool to identify who those low risk, low need, first offender, self-correct folks are and who aren't. We didn't have that in 2017 when we developed the rules. We didn't have a lot of the stuff that we have now, and a lot of the information that we have now is really, really new, like within the last 4 to 5 years. So yeah, absolutely. There are things in the rules that need to change. There's things in the statute that need to change, and that's exactly what we're here to identify. Any other questions about the scope and like I said, the document that we have up here and that was sent out to the group members, this is a draft. So we're giving it to you guys now, just a brief introduction. Really take your time between now and the next meeting to look it over. And know that this is not comprehensive of everything that we're going to talk about, because to put all of the feedback into one thing, it just you guys would be reading a stack of papers like this. So we'll be consolidating all of that information, bringing it to you guys in the next several meetings to really dig into what we've heard, where the areas of improvement are, where the gaps and the breakdowns are, and start looking at how do we address those. So I'm looking at the time. It looks like we've got about 20 minutes left today. Do folks have any other questions? Anything else that you guys want to make sure that we have, or anything that needs addressed before we wrap up today and get ready for our next meeting?
Marisha, can we take, perhaps it's just me, but can we take a moment for the committee members to introduce themselves and where they work and what their experience with DUII is? That would be great.
Absolutely. We're going to do some more of that next time, but we've got a few extra minutes. So yeah, absolutely. Heather, you want to start?
Oh, sure. See, that's what I get for essays. My name is Heather Jeffress. Currently I'm the executive director of the Oregon Council for Behavioral Health, which is a trade association that represents, we're somewhere between 52 and 58 members. We're onboarding a few new people as we speak. The agencies that are members of our association provide mental health and substance use disorder services. I would say over half of our members, close to half of our members, do DUII services. And then prior to my seat in the Oregon Council, as a trade association, we do all kinds of intergovernmental work, trainings, events, all the things trade associations do. I was a clinician, both mental health and SUD certified, and I actually worked for the State Court of Oregon for a significant time. And I was so excited to see the DUII court because I helped implement one of the first DUII courts in Clackamas County here in Oregon years ago. And I also was an ADIS for the treatment courts in Clackamas County at that time. So yeah, and I haven't been that close to DUII work since 2011. So I did appreciate a little catch up today. That was great. Except for what I hear from my members who are doing the work currently. So that's me.
Awesome. We'll go down the list. Jose, do you want to go next? Oh, we may have lost Jose. Oh, no, there he is.
There you go. I got it. I was sneezing I just turned around and I turned off my camera just to go sneeze. But caught me off guard. But hi, my name is Jose Garcia, and then I'm a DUI provider. I'm stationed in Eastern Oregon, and our program has been in the community for the last 25 years. And one of the main areas that we focus on is anybody with anyone that comes in with a DUI, we try to eliminate barriers and then make treatment successful for them. I'm just happy to be here and be part of this committee. I know I was in the sub-council for the governor's office, the governor's the racial justice council, and so it's a really way of providing with a variety of alternatives for people and help them to kind of be successful, basically, solve problems and help them to move forward with their lives, So, I hope my expertise bring some direction to, OHA, and, I'm just happy to help OHA to move forward. So, thank you so much.
We're really grateful that you're here. Bring a very valuable perspective, definitely from Eastern Oregon, and all of it. Fantastic.
Thank you.
Joseph.
Did you say Joseph?
Yes.
Oh, I'm Joseph LaMartina. I work at Tillamook Family Counseling Center, a northern coastal little town straight over from Portland. And I primarily work with addictions clients, and I am kind of the point person and primary provider for the DUII program here.
Awesome. Judge Bergstrom?
Hi, I'm Eric Bergstrom. I'm a circuit court judge in Multnomah County, and I am also what's called the State Judicial Outreach Liaison for Oregon for traffic safety issues in a joint thing with the American Bar Association and NHTSA. And so I'm a liaison to the Governor's Advisory Council on DUII and on a number of other programs related to treatment courts and the like. I ran the DUII intensive supervision program for several years in Multnomah County, and I'm very invested in treatment courts. So happy to be a part of the group.
Awesome. Glad you're here. Justin, you're next.
Hi, my name is Justin Nielsen. I am a licensed SED counselor. I'm owner and executive director of Oregon Recovery Behavioral Health. We have 2 locations in Salem and in Kaiser. The majority of our services are DUI, also including MAT services as well. And I also am a board member and sit with Kate, Duke, and Judge Bergstrom on the Governor's Advisory Council for DUI. So I'm really happy that, thank you, Marisha and Nicole, for bringing the stakeholders together. I know this is somewhat historic and monumental because as long as I've been in the field, we've never had a collaborative conversation like this one. So thank you.
Glad you're here. Thank you so much. Mark Patterson, would you like to introduce yourself?
I will. My name is Mark Patterson. I'm with the Oregon Department of Corrections, and it's going to be a long explanation of how this works. I'm with the Oregon Department of Corrections, part of the Community Corrections Division, and within that division, I am the Deputy Compact Administrator for Interstate Compact. And Interstate Compact is we track and monitor and approve the movement of offenders who have committed felonies and some types of misdemeanors, and DUI being one of those, on second convictions. So anyone who has a DUI sentence, second conviction, whether it's 10 years apart, 20 years apart, has to go through Interstate Compact if they're on supervision and need supervision. And so wide breadth of experience in regards to the prison aspect, community corrections aspect, and then a lot of experience with Oregonians who want to take their supervision to another state and have to go through the process of getting assessed and doing their treatment in another state and how we bring that together. So really excited to be a part of this group and offer any advice or help in what we deal with on our basis, and then learn from everyone here.
That's going to be a huge help. About 6% of the folks who get screened every year are referred to services out of state. And we also have a lot of folks who come in to Oregon with a DUI from another state. So having you on board is going to be super helpful. We really appreciate you being here. So thank you.
Appreciate that. We have a caseload of about 2,500 right now that come in or go out. And I'm actually going to run numbers before our next meeting to let everybody know how many DUIs we have in and out, and whether they're misdemeanors or felonies, so we kind of have a grasp of who we have within Interstate Compact.
That would be fantastic information to have. Thank you so much. You guys know me. I'm Marisha. I'm the DUI Services Coordinator, so I'll just stop at that and send it over to Matt Conrad.
Good afternoon. Marisha said, I'm Matt Conrad. I work at a treatment agency in the Tri-County area called LifeWorks Northwest. I've been with this agency for 16 years now and managing DUI services for 8 or 9. The days run together. I'm on multiple councils and committees here in Washington County for services for both youth and adult addictions and service improvements. I was honored to be picked to be on this work group, having also served on a number of rules advisory committees related to OHA rules and DUI services. Gosh, I just don't know what else to say about myself. I actually hate talking about myself, but I do love talking about DUI and DUI treatment and DUI recidivism. I loved everything that we heard today, and I'm looking forward to see what we can accomplish with this committee. So with that said, I'll shut up and let the next person talk.
Awesome. Thanks, Matt. And I accidentally skipped over LaLaurie. Sorry, LaLaurie.
That's okay. My name is LaLaurie Logger, and I am the Executive Director of Reconnections Counseling. We have offices in Lincoln City, Toledo, Newport, and Florence, and we also offer recovery housing as well. I've been doing DUI treatment since 1997, so that dates me. So, so when this thing came out and it focusing on like changing and, you know, kind of bringing it to evidence-based practices, I was really excited. So thank you for picking me to be on this committee.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here. Rick, you're up next.
Hi, my name is Rick Laracy. I'm with ADAPT. I've been doing DUI treatment for 10 years. I'm a CADC2 there. In Douglas County, I don't ever remember a DUI court. We have drug court we've had for years. We have a mental health court, but I don't ever remember a DUI court. And so that's something neat to hear about. And I'm very interested in that, and I would like to share it with my supervisor and the rest of the team here.
I'll tell you, back in the day, Rick, we tried. We tried.
Really? Okay. So we'll revisit that and see what happens.
We're going to add that to your list of action items. Rick's job is to start a DUI court in Douglas County.
Yeah.
Over
the last 10 years, I have seen so many people come back through my doors. It's amazing. Reoffenders, I question myself, did I not teach them anything at all? But DUI number 2, 3, 4, and 5, and it's like, oh man. So I think we have a big problem in not only Oregon, but Douglas County for sure.
Yeah.
So I'm glad to be here and be a part of this.
Yes. Awesome. Thank you so much, Rick. Mm-hmm. Robbie, do you prefer Robbie or Robert?
I prefer Robbie. My name is Robert or Robbie Noche. I live in Malone County. I'm on their Malone County's Behavioral Health Advisory Board, or BHAC for short. I'm on several state and county advisory boards. Did a lot of volunteering, but I'm also a person in recovery. The most memorable volunteer position was when I was in San Diego over 10 years ago. I volunteered for San Diego's Veteran Village of San Diego, and I did homeless court and a stand down there. So, and the most important part, this is going to be a new and interesting experience for me.
Awesome. We're really glad to have you. Having the recovery perspective in this conversation is hugely important. So I really want to honor you and thank you for taking the time to be a part of this group. We appreciate it very much. Robbie, Tammy Hooper.
Here I am. Let me take up my mask. Hi, I'm Tammy Hooper. I work for NAR Northwest, and I am the outpatient manager for subs, and we have a DUI treatment program here. I've been here almost 5 years, and yeah, I'm just glad. I'm happy to be on the committee. This is my first committee, I think, of this type. So I've done other work, regionally or locally. So it's been a minute, so it's good. It's good to be back into something, and it sounds like there's some good information that I'm looking forward to learning about and contributing, and how we can Yeah, it just is so cookie cutter. Yeah, so more individualized. That would be great to have some variety for people to meet their needs.
Absolutely, absolutely. Especially making sure that our tribal members' needs are met as well, and other cultures and language access is another huge piece that we're going to be talking about, is making sure that folks have access to services that they understand and can fully participate in. So,
right.
Yeah. Awesome. Tanya Cochran.
Hello, my name is Tanya Cochran. I am an ADIS from Lane County. I work with several of the courts down here, providing ADIS screenings and referrals.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We're glad you're here. Winona. Oh, did we lose Winona? We may have. Let me check our participants. Oh, I think she may have had to leave early. Let's see. Mary Garcia, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, yeah. Mary Garcia. I'm with DMV. I am a process and policy analyst in the driver programs area of DMV. The programs I oversee there include DUII, implied consent, ignition interlock device, and juvenile court denials. I'm also the liaison for the Governor's Advisory Committee, and I've been with DMV for over 30 years. So, I also oversee the DUI completion certificate component of the reinstatement requirements after a DUI suspension. So glad to be here.
We are so glad that you're here, Mary. It's a huge part of the process, and we definitely want to make sure that any changes we make don't impact anybody's driving privileges moving forward. So I'm super glad that you're able to be here. Okay, we started halfway through. So Chris Wig.
Hi, Marisha. My name is Chris Wig, and I am the program director here at Emergence Addiction and Behavioral Therapies in Eugene. We have offices in Eugene and Springfield and Albany and Florence and all kinds of great places in the Willamette Valley, and that I work with courts, adjudicated programs, drug court, veterans court, mental health court. And so I'm real happy to be here, and I think that we can make a difference and help people a lot with that risk needs and responsivity that we heard James talking about.
Absolutely. Hopefully we'll get a deep dive on Lane County too. Deborah Ruiz, were you able to join? You know?
Yes, I'm here, Marisha.
Yay!
Yay! So I've been doing evaluations since 1984. I do evaluations for Washington County and Multnomah County and Columbia County. So I am very happy to be on this committee. I think we're going to be able to get a lot done, and I'm very excited for what the future can hold for all of us.
So glad you're here. Deborah is one of the few remaining original OG alcohol and drug screening specialists. So super glad to have your valuable historical knowledge with us.
Yeah, Margaret and Teresa have left me. Yeah, they retired this summer, so I'm like the oldie left.
I think it's you and Jeannie. You guys are holding down the fort.
Yeah, but hey, yeah, I love what I do, and I know that we can make some changes and some improvements and save lives. Absolutely. So thank you for having me.
Thank you all for being here. I think I got everybody. Is there anybody that I missed? Nicole, do you want to give a little spiel about you and your role in the agency?
I sort of gave that spiel when I introduced myself beforehand, but I will just remind all y'all that I actually, before I came to the state and became a bureaucrat, I was a administrator and program director and manager for many years, and I did manage a couple of DUII programs, and I remember that that balance, right, of trying to provide treatment, but also trying to think about public safety, and frankly feeling like I was an expert on substance use disorder and treatment, but I wasn't an expert on the courts or on what someone needed to do to get their driver's license back and so forth. So I am looking at this from the lens of OHA now, but also from the lens of, gosh, I would really like to make services better for people who are getting services, and services easier and more understandable for those who are providing them. So I just want to echo Marisha's thanks to all of you for being here. I think this is going to be a good process.
Awesome. Well, I don't know about you guys, but my head is feeling very full. I feel like I need to just kind of sit down and rehash this and take a deep breath. But again, I just want to, I truly mean this, you guys. I cannot say how much it means to have you all take the time out of your busy schedules to work through this with us. This has been a labor of love for me. This is the project that I've been working on for the last 4 years. Really excited to see it take off and have everyone who is so committed not only to providing excellent services, but also to ensuring that our roadways are safe and that people get the services that they need when they need them. So I just thank you, thank you, thank you. I look forward to working with all of you, and you will be hearing more from me shortly with follow-up notes, meetings, appointments for future meetings, and all of that good stuff. So thanks again, you guys. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye, Jose.
Bye.